Okay, so one of the resources I wanted to draw your attention to is a website called Killing Times. It's managed by the Guardian newspaper, but it's based on research from the University of Newcastle, and there's a lot that's been done. So just a bit of a warning here. The site does not contain images of people who have died. However, the historical records reproduced here use archaic terms that are offensive, and the themes and content within will be distressing to many people. Discretion is advised. So you can make your own mind up on that. Now, what they've done is they've created a map of the frontier war, so violence between Indigenous people and European white settlers in Australia. Now, probably one of the most sobering aspects of it is you can use this slider here to select the date range you want to look at. But if we slide it this way, we're looking towards later and later massacres. But I mean, look, let's slide this up to 1920, so 100 years ago. This is after World War I. There are still massacres of Indigenous people happening here. We've got one in 1928, another 1920, 1924, 1920, 1922. So when people tend to think of frontier violence, so violence between Indigenous people and settlers, they tend to think of it as, you know, something happened ages and ages and ages ago. My nana died last year. She would have been old enough to remember 1928, so that puts some things in perspective. We do notice that areas that have been invaded and settled earlier tend to disappear the first when you slide that way. But the one that I wanted to draw your attention to is here. This one. Alright, so Mt Cottrell. So if you think that's pretty close to where our school is, you're right. It's 20 minutes drive. That's how close it is. It's called Mt Cottrell. It's not much of a mountain. That's it there, but that's the title. So what happened? So the motive for this massacre was reprisals of killing civilians. Aboriginal dead people, mean here means average, so 55. So the minimum estimate is 10. The maximum estimate is 100. Colonizers dead, 2. And there's a couple of sources here that they've used. Now this happened in 1836, so remember this is quite early on in the settlement invasion of Melbourne. But following the discovery of the mutilated bodies of Mr. Charles Franks, a settler from Van Diemen's Land, which is Tasmania, and his shepherd, Thomas Flinders, a party of 17 men armed with muskets, which is a type of gun, comprising of 8 male colonists, 4 Sydney Aboriginal people, so Aboriginals from Sydney, 5 domesticated Aboriginal people from the Port Phillip district. So what they mean there is Aboriginal people who are working with the Europeans for whatever reason. Proceeded in search of the natives whom they supposed to be the murderers of Mr. Franks and his shepherd. The 8 colonists were Henry Batman. Now, some of you might know of John Batman, the guy who originally said, well, there's this place called Port Phillip Bay, and it'd be a really good place to have a settlement. Henry Batman was his brother. John Wood, David Pitcairn, Mr. Guy, Alexander Thompson, William Winberry, George Hollins, and Michael Leonard. The 4 Sydney Aborigines included Bullitt, Stewart, and Joe the Marine. The 4 Port Phillip Aboriginal people included Bembo, Derrymock, Ballian, and Bate lineage. John Montague, the colonial secretary in Van Diemen's Land, wrote to his counterpart in New South Wales on 18th of August 1836. They came up with a tribe consisting of men, women, and children, the number of about 50 to 100, and perceiving upon the persons of some of them articles which were recognised as having belonged to Mr. Franks, a rencontre followed. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. Okay, so they saw a group of people, about 50 to 100, and perceiving upon the persons of them some of the articles which were recognised as having belonged to Mr. Franks. So what they mean there is they're talking about stuff that the guy who was killed, Mr. Franks, they've seen some of their belongings with these people. And now, rencontre means an argument or a fight. In this case, it means shooting. It is not stated what resistance the natives made, but none of the opposing party were injured, although there can be little doubt that 10 of the tribe of Port Phillip natives were killed. William Lonsdale, a magistrate at Port Phillip, from late September 1836, was instructed by the Colonial Secretary in Sydney to investigate the incident. But none of the perpetrators interviewed would acknowledge the rencontre, although it was clear that each person interviewed had something to hide. So they're denying what happened. Those interviewed by Lonsdale were Henry Batman, John Wood, Michael Leonard, and William Winberry. Winberry acknowledged that a party went after the blacks, and they were found and fired on. Several shots were fired. A child was found belonging to the fugitives, but he did not see that any of the blacks were killed or hurt. The murderers of Franks and Flinders were Callan and Dundon, apparently. Leonard heard that some were wounded but paid no attention to it. Okay. Now, we've got an article here by Thomas Rogers, who is a historian. He's got a PhD in history and he works with the Australian War Memorial, and he's written pretty extensively on this incident, actually. But he says that in common with other pastoral incursions, so people settling land and taking land in order to make farms, the Australian colonies from as early as the 1810s, Port Phillip was the site of a struggle for control of land and water between incoming British squatters. So a squatter is someone who fences off land and says, okay, this is mine now, and indigenous landowners. The grasslands of Port Phillip, created by generations of Aboriginal burning patterns, drew the attention of squatters. John Batman himself inadvertently noticed this, commenting that the plains of Port Phillip appeared like a land laid out in farms for some 100 years back and every tree transplanted. The pastoralists' hard-hoofed sheep broke down riverbanks and caused soil erosion and compressed topsoil, causing the depletion of staple foods for Aboriginal clans. This led Aboriginal hunters to spear sheep instead, which in turn led to settler retribution that was often extremely bloody. Charles Franks and the Shepherd were among the first casualties of this war for resources, and the rapid and brutal settler response to their deaths foreshadowed many other such responses in Port Phillip. So Mr. Rogers here is portraying these events as a fight between over resources, pretty much. So indigenous people used these lands to get their food, to get all the stuff they needed to live. And when people, when the British came and pushed them out so that they could farm sheep, Rogers says that this created a war for resources. So he portrays this very much as a war in the classical sense. Something that I thought you also might want to pay attention to. You would have learnt about Derrimut earlier. So this is Derrimut's gravestone, and actually one of the people that it says Derrimut saved, here, Henry Batman, in 1835. So I wonder if Derrimut knew that the person that he saved went on to become this Henry Batman, who was taking part in the massacre at Mt Cottrell. Food for thought. Anyway, continue on to the next slide and have a go at the questions there.